Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. One of the numerous things the era of COVID has exposed is just how dependent Canada is on global trade, supply chains, and manufacturing. How many times have you gone to a store only to be told that there's a delay with a shipment from overseas, or that there's a backlog at the port, or perhaps you've seen the headlines in the past few months highlighting the plight of car manufacturers who are stalled in building new vehicles due to semiconductor chip shortages. And this isn't a problem exclusive to Canada. It's a global problem. Just think of the personal protective equipment, or PPE, crisis during COVID. Countries struggled to get their orders fulfilled, and this left many of us asking, why are we not manufacturing these goods within our own borders? It seems to always come back to the almighty dollar. Manufacturing and production costs in other jurisdictions can be markedly lower, thereby benefiting shareholders with increased profits. So will reshoring take hold here in Canada? How will this impact our international relationships? And perhaps most importantly, how will this impact your wallet? Well, joining me now to share his insight is the Honourable Tony Clement, former Minister of Industry, co-chair of Reshoring Canada, and host of Boom and Bust right here on our network. Welcome, Tony. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Tanya, as always.
Okay, excellent. Let's dive right in. For our viewers' benefit, could you please explain what is reshoring?
Reshoring is the idea that certain aspects of the supply chain could be better dealt with onshore, or taking them away from the global supply chains that are the rule right now, as you said in your introduction. So an example could be semiconductors, for instance. There's a big play right now to have those semiconductor factories in North America rather than in Asia. Critical minerals is another example. Those are things that make possible electric vehicles, or the batteries that are found in electric vehicles. Those substances are found in Canada, but right now 70% of that supply chain is basically ruled by the People's Republic of China. So the idea is to have a more resilient supply chain means more products being manufactured in Canada or North America, or certainly having that supply chain available.
Okay, now you've highlighted a couple of industries, automotive, for example. What other, or is this perhaps the most important sector that has been most exposed by COVID in terms of supply chain management? Is there any other industry you'd like to highlight?
Well, certainly you mentioned PPE. This was the icing on the cake for people's realization that our supply chains matter. It used to be supply chains would be talked about by people with pen protectors in their shirts. It was not really a big topic, but now certainly during and post-COVID, if we are in post-COVID, it now is. And so the first item was when we were all trying to scramble around, trying to get personal protective equipment, masks, gowns, gloves, respirators even. All of a sudden, people realized that 98% of that was controlled by the Chinese.
Right.
And, and there was all sorts of breaks in the supply chain. The stories I've heard of, whole plane loads of masks being sold to buyers, and then they find another buyer that wants to pay slightly more, and then those masks disappear. So there was no certainty of supply chain, and that created a lot of shortages. Closer to where we are right now, Tanya, it's all been about vaccine production.
Right.
And again, realization that, if you really want to protect your people, you should be concerned about where we have vaccines coming from, and whether we have local ability to produce those vaccines.
Right. No, absolutely. And we have about 50 seconds before commercial, but you were the Minister of Health provincially in Ontario during the SARS crisis. And so when I'm looking at, this exposure, if you will, of our supply chain, I thought, well, why didn't that, or maybe it did that health crisis expose our similar vulnerabilities? Why or why not? 30 seconds.
It did. And certainly there were recommendations after SARS to make sure we had stockpiles for just this emergency. And then people forgot about that advice, and then we came up short. So again, we have to relearn that lesson.
Okay, well, that's interesting that you mentioned that. that those recommendations has come through, and this whole sudden scramble this last go with COVID, it shouldn't probably have happened. But anyways, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on why reshoring might be important right after this commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing reshoring, and we're joined by the co-chair of Reshoring Canada, the Honourable Tony Clement, former Minister of Industry, and also the host of Boom and Bust right here on the News Forum Network. Tony, we were discussing kind of about a decade ago, 15 years ago, almost actually 20 years ago, when you were the Minister of Health during the SARS crisis, and how there was a recommendation to reshore, if you will, a lot of these PPE manufacturing, et cetera. And thinking kind of more broadly, I think of just-in-time inventory systems, and they seem to be all the rage a few decades ago. They no longer seem to function in this kind of environment of unpredictable global trade and transportation. Are shortened and concentrated supply lines closer to the end market solution? Is this the solution?
It can be. And so what we're talking about at Reshoring Canada is having a resilient local supply chain. It means that we're not rejecting the idea that to assemble an automobile, for instance, it might go 6 or 7 times across the U.S. border as you're assembling the vehicle. But there are certain cases to be made that a lot of that supply chain could be local manufacturing. And so we're going to be producing basically an algorithm for use by local businesses called the total cost of ownership. We're basically working with our counterpart in the United States, the Reshoring Initiative, by a fellow by the name of Harry Moser. He's been doing this for about 20 years. And he's got a great algorithm which we want to Canadianize, which will indicate whether it makes dollars and cents to actually bring that part of the manufacturing process back to Canada. We think in a lot of cases it does make sense, because it should not just be about labor costs.
Right.
Yes, China is a lot less expensive, although their prices are creeping up, but their labor costs are less expensive right now. But when you look at the total cost, including the transportation, and when you add in things like ESG goals, environmental, social governance goals, which a lot of companies are doing now, then it really swings it back to saying, hey, there is a financial case to manufacture it locally. So we're going to be advising companies whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and we're going to be advocating with government and with industry that this should be looked at.
I think that's fascinating, especially when you suggest that you're going to also be looking at kind of the social, eco, and ethical conscience of when you're sourcing, say, a semiconductor chip or some component, some certain mineral. How is that being sourced? Is it coming from child labor? Is it coming from work camps? And you're right, I'm very happy to see that many corporations are now considering that kind of ethical component when deciding where to do business and with whom. So this to me seems like definitely a step in the right direction. But I guess, it always comes down to the almighty dollar. You're host of Boom and Bust, so I feel like this is where we have to go with this. Like most manufacturers typically go offshore because the cost is lower. Yes, labor, and also materials to some capacity. How do you feel, and I know you said you're going to do the survey, but how do you feel that this will impact the price of goods?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess we're making the case that it might not be as severe as people ordinarily assume. There are other social goals that are important too. You mentioned a couple. What about national security? I believe that should be a goal of our country and our allies as well. And certainly when you look at vaccine production, PPE, certain goods that are produced by critical minerals, if you want to produce electric vehicles in North America, you've got to care about critical minerals. So like lithium, for example. Right. So you want that supply chain totally controlled by the People's Republic of China. I think from a national security point of view, the answer's got to be no. We've got to have better control. That's the argument that's being made over semiconductors right now.
Right. And, just to really explain it to our viewers, and we have about a minute before commercial, explain how this semiconductor chip crisis has really impacted the automotive industry.
Yeah, there's been a shortage of new vehicles rolling off the assembly line. And I can tell you that has impacted on the price of those new vehicles. And it's also impacted on the price of used vehicles because no one can get new vehicles. So it has had a huge impact as they slowly turn the ship around to produce locally semiconductors, which takes years to build a plant, a large semiconductor plant. So there is no short-term solution to this, and it's having a huge impact in the auto sector and other relevant sectors for sure.
Okay, and just 20 seconds rather before commercial, what caused the shortage of the semiconductor?
I think it was a decision that you don't want to rely on the supply chain that is controlled by your adversary, and so China was trying to seek control, and Biden and others decided that is not in the long-term interest of the United States or the Western allies.
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation of reshoring with the co-chair of Reshoring Canada, the Honourable Tony Clement, former Minister of Industry and host of Boom and Bust right here on our network. Tony, we discussed automotive sector, a little bit on pharmaceuticals, also manufacturing PPE sectors. Which industries do you feel are more likely to come back to reshore to Canada?
Well, we've had some pretty good conversations in the general manufacturing area, auto parts and other parts, machine parts, machine tools, those kinds of things. Obviously, those are expensive things to produce anyway. And of course, there's a lot of concerns about intellectual property theft when you go offshore as well. I should have mentioned that.
Right, that's a good point.
So there's all sorts of reasons why. The reaction when we launched this organization, Reshoring Canada, on April 24th, I was really surprised at the immediate reaction of the manufacturing sector, particularly in southwestern Ontario and eastern Ontario, basically saying it's about time.
Right.
That was action. It wasn't, why are you doing this, or what's this all about? It's, yeah, finally somebody gets it, that we've got to do a better job of reshoring. That was President Biden. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that was exactly my reaction and I was so pleased. I was like, oh, look, Tony's busy off doing even more things now. Not that you have such a full plate already. I said, sorry, this hadn't been done before. Like this, yes, this is necessary. Reshoring must happen.
Yeah, and it seems to be riding a bit of a wave right now. President Trump started the ball rolling with an agreement with Canada on basically working together on critical minerals and rare earth elements. When President Biden got elected, he's got a whole task force looking at what he calls friend shoring. Okay. And by that he means, not only manufacturing the U.S., but also U.S. allies like Canada. And so they're looking at pharma, as you mentioned. They're looking at critical minerals, but they're also looking at the basic manufacturing sector to see what can be done to have a different supply chain mechanism. So all of these areas are in play right now, and there seems to be a lot of discussion going cross-border. We're doing a survey right now. We're just completing a survey of Canadian CEOs and Canadian companies of where the gaps are when it comes to supply chain. That's never been done before in this way. And once we get the results, we'll be able to advocate for better policies coming from the Government of Canada and from various provincial governments when it comes to supply chain.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to hear all of these things. You mentioned America and their friend shoring, and their closest friends, I suppose, would be Canada and Mexico. So I think of the CUSMA, basically the updated free trade agreement, if you will. And obviously Canada has a very unique relationship with the US and with Mexico. Are we taking advantage of all that CUSMA affords?
I would say no at this point. I think there's a lot more work that has to be done by Canadian industry. We kind of take it for granted that we can have access to the US market. But competition is fierce, and what's happening, as you probably know, Tanya, I think you've had it as a segment on your show in the past, is there's a big push in the U.S. Congress that buy American. And if they're going to go with a $2 trillion infrastructure program in the United States and it's buy American, right, Canadian manufacturers could lose out. So there's a constant need to have that dialogue with American authorities in Congress and in the White House to make sure that we continue to have access. So I took it as a very positive sign that President Biden called it friend shoring. I'd never heard that term before. I think he or one of his one of his people created that term, but it's a good term for them to use rather than just saying everything has to be in America.
Right.
So hopefully that bodes well for the future.
Well, it sounds definitely less isolationist. So let's focus back on Ontario. Ontario is the US's third largest trading partner if you were to isolate Ontario on its own. How does President Biden's Buy American executive order put that relationship at risk, if at all?
Yeah, obviously, there's a big concern amongst Ontario manufacturers that they're going to be elbowed aside for a U.S.-based manufacturer. I've had discussions with the Ontario government about this, Vic Fedeli, who's the trade minister, but we also have Ontario agents in various key cities like New York City, like Chicago, like Miami, and I've had discussions with them because they have been working on an initiative in the United States about a North America-wide supply chain advocacy. And they wanted to make sure that Reshoring Canada wasn't at odds with that. I assured them that it was not.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion right when we return. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion of reshoring, this concept of reshoring, and joining me is co-chair of Reshoring Canada, the Honourable Tony Clement. Tony, before commercial break, we're discussing our relationship with the U.S., how all of this might work with having a North America supply chain. And again, I'm thinking to the topic du jour, which is vaccines. And, the government was, I think we could say, embarrassed in the past year, our government, with how little capacity we have left in pharmaceuticals. And I now see that the government has recently committed $200 million to help, Resilience Biotechnologies develop vaccines and therapeutics. Is this enough of a response?
Yeah, I applauded that announcement when it took place. I thought it was definitely a step in the right direction. Certainly, I would like to see more local, Canadian-wide, perhaps, work when it comes to the leading edge vaccines, whether they're mRNA or there's also DNA level vaccines that are being developed as well. So, we've got to we have to continue to be leading edge. We have amongst the best researchers. We have them amongst the best research institutions in this country. We should be leading the way, and we haven't been. Incidentally, when I was federal health minister, Tanya, I did have a vaccine contract with one of the pharmaceutical companies, a 10-year contract to ensure that we had local supply for vaccine. Unfortunately, that contract was not renewed, and then we found ourselves in this situation where we were scrambling around trying to find other vaccine sources. So I think lessons from COVID, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from COVID, and one of them has got to be we've got to have local vaccine capacity. Absolutely.
No, I agree. Especially if, we're a G7 nation. It makes no sense that we can't have our own capabilities right here. And I think it would actually also help limit the brain drain, if I can use this old phrase. But the emigration of our top talent in this country to go elsewhere where there are jobs in, for example, pharmaceutical manufacturing and whatnot. Let's pivot for a moment. We only have a couple more minutes left in the interview, and I think you and I could chat for hours on this topic. Well, at least I find it interesting. When we talk about Canada's burgeoning electric vehicle sector, we keep saying, encouraged and incentivized to, buy these electric vehicles and whatnot. But you bring up a good point where we're reliant on, metal and battery needs. How can Canada, here on our soil, fulfill our needs for that burgeoning sector?
We've got to have a strategy that we certainly have the inputs. We have the minerals in northwestern Ontario and Western Canada to make sure that we could be a world leader in battery production and electric vehicle production. So you've got to help. The government's got to help those miners and organizations that are committed to this to get on their feet. There's no question about that. And I think it's a matter of national security. So I don't mind a little bit of government intervention when it has to do with national security. There's no question about that. So people are waiting for that sort of signal from the federal government initially. I can tell you that the Ontario government has a supply chain task force looking at critical minerals. So this is definitely a topic du jour, as you mentioned, and it has to be. We want to be part of the green revolution. We want to have these green manufacturing capabilities. China has a very specific strategy. They want to be the source for green energy for the world.
Right.
They were reliant on oil, and they felt vulnerable.
Yes.
If oil isn't going to be what it used to be, then all of a sudden they're going to be the source for the green revolution when it comes to energy. We've got to be part of that too.
Yes, we cannot be vulnerable. Okay, we have 20 seconds left. What government incentives would you like to see for reshoring?
I'd just like to see them helping companies start up and be part of this sector. I don't think it costs too much money to do that, and I think that would be a good start.
Okay, excellent. Honourable Tony Clement, thank you so much for your time. It was an excellent lesson in reshoring, and for more information, visit Reshoring Canada.
Thank you.
Well, COVID certainly exposed vulnerabilities within Canada for global trade, supply chains, manufacturing. We have lessons that will come out of COVID. We must learn from the lessons, and I think we must act quickly. Tony explained very well how China will dominate in the electrical vehicle sector. Canada has the capability. Why not reshore and give the Canadians the job and unearth our real potential? For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.